The August sun bore down on Austin, Texas, casting heat waves across the modern glass facade of the Hale Energy headquarters. Inside, the air conditioning buzzed faintly as dozens of professionals, executives, and guests took their seats for the highly anticipated Hale Sustainability Conference. Banners proclaiming innovation for a greener future lined the auditorium walls, and staff bustled around, adjusting microphones and distributing last-minute programs. In the third row from the front, Michael Reed adjusted his tie for the third time in 10 minutes. At 49 years old, with salt and pepper hair and a reputation for operational efficiency, Michael had spent the last 2 decades climbing the corporate ladder. As regional operations manager, he was a fixture at events like this, known for his no-nonsense demeanor and quiet authority. He was expecting a familiar face to open the conference. The original keynote speaker, a well-known industry veteran, had been suddenly replaced. Michael had skimmed the updated program earlier, noting the change but barely registering the name that replaced it. He assumed it would be another over-polished consultant with flashy slides and vague promises. As he scrolled through emails on his phone, a hush swept across the front rows. A young woman, poised and composed, approached with measured steps. She wore a tailored navy suit, her natural curls tied back into a neat bun. Her presence was magnetic, not because she was flashy, but because she carried herself with a quiet certainty, a strength that didn't need to announce itself. She stopped in front of Michael and extended her hand with a polite smile. "Good morning, Mr. Reed. It's a pleasure to meet you." Michael looked up, momentarily confused. He glanced at her outstretched hand, then around the room. A few people nearby were watching, waiting to see how he would respond. Without thinking, he gave a curt nod and replied, "Morning," avoiding the handshake altogether. Instead, he gave a small wave as if brushing the gesture aside, pretending not to notice the pause that followed. The woman did not let her smile falter, but there was a flicker in her eyes, an almost imperceptible tightening, a signal that she had noticed a rejection and she would not forget it. She stepped aside without another word and continued toward the stage. Around Michael, the mood subtly shifted. Conversations that had been cheerful moments before now carried an undertone of unease. A few glances flicked toward him, curious or maybe disappointed. He felt it, the weight of their silent judgment, though he told himself it meant nothing. Maybe he was just caught off guard, he reasoned. Maybe he wasn't in the mood for small talk. But something in the way she held his gaze, calm, unimpressed, made him feel uncomfortably exposed. Michael rubbed the back of his neck and turned his eyes to the event program still on his lap. He hadn't read the name carefully earlier. The bold letters now stared back at him. Keynote speaker, Dr. Naomi Ellis, CEO, Ellis Tech. He squinted at the page. Ellis. The name echoed faintly in his mind, familiar but unanchored. He flipped the page, looking for the short biography. PhD in environmental engineering, founder of Ellis Tech, recognized by the Department of Energy for breakthroughs in solar storage systems. The rest became a blur. Ellis, he muttered under his breath. And that's when it hit him. The Ellis Tech. Years ago, during a statewide power crisis that nearly bankrupted Hale's southern operations, a small but nimble tech firm had stepped in with emergency battery deployments that stabilized the grid and prevented cascading failures. It had been a rare act of corporate agility and generosity. Ellis Tech had refused to gouge prices during the crisis, a move that earned them respect across the sector. Michael remembered reading about it at the time. He remembered the headlines, the press conferences, the name Ellis associated with bold innovation, but he had never looked up the face behind it. He assumed, like many in his circle, that Ellis was a man, maybe in his 50s or 60s, with long pedigree in engineering. A name like Naomi had never crossed his mind. Now that name, Naomi Ellis, stood in front of the podium, adjusting the mic. Michael leaned back in his chair, feeling suddenly very small. The audience quieted as the event director took the stage and cleared his throat. His voice rang out. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here today. It is our great honor to welcome a leader in sustainable innovation, a visionary in clean energy, and one of the most respected voices in environmental engineering. Please give a warm welcome to Dr. Naomi Ellis." Applause erupted around the room. Michael clapped stiffly, eyes locked on the woman he had just dismissed with a casual wave. Her smile returned, but it was to the room now, not for him. As she began her keynote address, Michael found himself unable to focus on her words at first. His mind raced with the implications of what had just happened. He had judged her the moment she approached. Too young, too confident, too different. And in his moment of hesitation, of bias, if he dared to name it, he had committed a slight that was now burning through him. The woman he had refused to shake hands with was not only the guest of honor, but the founder of the very company that had once saved his own from the brink. He shifted in his seat again, the air-conditioned room suddenly feeling too warm. What Michael didn't realize, what hadn't even occurred to him, was that Naomi's last name carried not just professional weight, but a generational legacy. A legacy that would soon unfold in front of him, word by word, exposing not just innovation and leadership, but a lineage of resistance, of dignity, and a relentless perseverance that would make his gesture not just awkward, but something far more painful. And he had missed all of it because he hadn't listened, because he hadn't looked beyond a face, because sometimes a single handshake can reveal everything a man still needs to learn. Naomi stood at the podium with a calm that did not need to announce itself. She didn't rush, didn't perform. Her voice, steady and confident, cut through the quiet air like a smooth blade. She wasn't there to impress. She was there to say something that mattered. Her opening lines immediately deviated from the expected. Rather than launching into charts or policy breakdowns, she began with a story. Not hers, at least not right away, but one about a storm that had devastated a small town outside Houston 5 years earlier. The region's grid had collapsed in under an hour. Emergency services had failed. It was the kind of moment where systems revealed their fragility, where promises of innovation crumbled under real pressure. And then she said it, how a last-minute partnership between Hale Energy and a small tech firm had stabilized the area just in time to prevent a blackout across the entire southeast region. She spoke about how the firm had mobilized battery storage within 24 hours, how the data from that operation was still studied in classrooms and engineering circles. The audience, particularly the executives, leaned in. Michael, who had been dreading every new sentence, now sat paralyzed. He remembered that storm. He remembered the internal chaos, the near collapse, and the scrambling for solutions. But more than that, he remembered how lucky they had been that someone stepped in. Naomi smiled, then said, "That firm was Ellis Tech. That solution was ours." And that moment, when we decided to act without waiting for permission, profit, or protocol, is what shaped our company's mission. She paused, let the weight of it settle. There was no arrogance in her tone, just clarity, just truth. What followed wasn't a self-congratulatory speech, nor was a sales pitch. It was a case study in courage and clarity. Naomi broke down the response plan, how her team had designed modular battery units that could be deployed rapidly, how they chose to redirect supplies from a high-paying private contract to assist a community in crisis, and how they negotiated, in real time, with government agencies to clear red tape that would have otherwise left the region in the dark for days. She spoke of systems and failures, but also of responsibility. Technology means nothing if it's not accountable to people, she said at one point, and the sentence hung in the air longer than most. Michael was not alone in his discomfort. Several executives from competing firms whispered behind their hands, glancing at one another as Naomi effortlessly displayed not just competence, but a moral clarity that corporate boardrooms rarely produced. There was no bravado. She didn't need it. Her slides showed the data. Her words showed the conviction. And slowly, a shift began to ripple through the room. Not just admiration, but recognition. When she moved into her closing segment, Naomi made another pivot. She began to speak more personally, not about the company, but about legacy. "I stand here not only as the founder of Ellis Tech," she said, "but as the granddaughter of Rosa Ellis." The name landed softly, but for those familiar with the Civil Rights Archives, it struck like a match. Rosa Ellis, activist, organizer, and one of the lesser-known figures who helped coordinate voter registration campaigns across the South during the early 1960s. Naomi's eyes moved across the audience. Steady, unwavering. She was arrested 6 times. She marched in Birmingham. She lost 2 jobs for refusing to remove her natural hair in the workplace. She told me, "People will make decisions about you before you open your mouth. But open your mouth anyway." A few heads nodded quietly in the rows. Michael sat frozen. Naomi continued, "My mother, Marla Ellis, built the first community-owned solar cooperative in our neighborhood. She believed that access to energy was a civil right. That clean air was not a luxury." Naomi's voice never cracked, but there was something in her eyes now, something that invited the room to listen not just with their ears, but with their assumptions disarmed. "So when you hear Ellis, I want you to know it is not just a company. It is a story. It is blood and sacrifice and vision handed down through generations." Michael, who had moments ago thought of Ellis as a faceless competitor, now sat in the presence of a narrative far bigger than himself. He thought of the way he had dismissed her, quietly, casually, publicly. The refusal to shake her hand now felt not just awkward, but brutal. He had assumed she was new, unknown, secondary. Instead, she had built a company that had saved his. She had spoken softly about revolutions, about systems, but also about dignity. And somehow, she had done it without once needing to call attention to what others might use for leverage. She didn't need to list awards, though there were many. She didn't need to speak of challenges, though they were obvious. She had simply told the truth about her work, her family, her purpose. And in doing so, she had redefined the room. The director of the conference returned to the stage, eyes visibly damp, and thanked Naomi with a sincerity that rarely graced corporate events. As she stepped down from the podium, applause erupted, not the polite, expected kind, but the real kind, the kind that follows impact. Michael clapped too, though his hands felt heavier than usual. When the break began, people flocked toward Naomi. Engineers, students, executives, they all wanted a word, a handshake, a moment. She gave it to them all graciously. Michael stayed in his seat, unsure whether to move or disappear. He looked down at his event program again, and for the first time, truly read the biography beneath her name. He wondered how many times he had glanced past names like hers without a second thought, how many hands he had ignored, how many voices he had never truly heard. A few feet away, a younger intern who worked under Michael leaned over and said quietly, "She's incredible, isn't she?" Michael didn't respond immediately. He just nodded, his throat tight. Then, after a moment, he muttered, "I made a mistake." The intern didn't ask for details. The weight of those 4 words was already enough. But the moment of reflection would not be the end. What Michael couldn't yet know was that Naomi had noticed everything. Every glance, every hesitation, every absence of acknowledgement. And though she hadn't called him out by name, she was about to deliver a lesson that would reach him and everyone else in that room, with a precision far sharper than any public confrontation. Because sometimes dignity is louder than confrontation, and sometimes a quiet truth leaves the deepest mark. After the break, the conference resumed with panel discussions and technical workshops, but the air inside the auditorium had subtly changed. It wasn't just that Naomi Ellis had impressed the audience. She had shifted something foundational. The conversations that followed, once filled with jargon and predictable optimism, now carried a sense of introspection. Attendees referred to community integration and corporate responsibility with sincerity that hadn't been there that morning. Naomi, after delivering her keynote, didn't retreat into the VIP lounge or disappear behind a veil of handlers. Instead, she moved between sessions, engaging with engineers, students, and even competitors with the same composure and attentiveness she had shown on stage. Michael kept his distance. His pride, battered by the silent shame he had carried since the handshake incident, acted like a tether. He wanted to approach her, to offer some kind of apology or acknowledgement, but he also knew it would be selfish. She didn't need to hear from him right then, not while she was still in the eye of the storm her words had created. And yet, his mind refused to move on. Every conversation he joined, every presentation he half listened to, was punctuated by echoes of her speech. The calm invocation of legacy, the unapologetic truth, the weight of the name Ellis. During one session in the afternoon, Naomi was invited to join a fireside chat with a former energy policy advisor. The session was billed as a casual conversation, but it quickly deepened. The moderator asked about the future of energy, about policy shifts and technology. Naomi answered with precision, but again, she returned to something more human. She spoke of her grandmother again, this time with more detail. Rosa Ellis hadn't just marched. She had organized literacy drives, had run underground legal aid operations, had trained young black women to pass civil service exams at a time when those doors were tightly shut. Naomi's voice remained steady, but her words carried more weight now. Less presentation, more testimony. My grandmother believed the most radical thing a person could do was survive with their dignity intact, she said, and to make space for others to do the same. Then, turning slightly, as if to speak more intimately with the room, she added, "When I walk into a room like this, I carry her with me, not just her name, but the countless rooms she was never allowed to enter." The room fell into a hush that didn't lift for several seconds. Michael felt it like a pin pressing directly against his conscience. He remembered being a young man in corporate America, told in unspoken ways how to behave, how to dress, how to blend in. But he had never known what it was like to be excluded before being introduced. Never had to carry a name that was both a beacon and a burden. The moderator followed up with a softer question. Something about mentorship, and Naomi shared how her mother had built Ellis Tech's first lab out of a repurposed community center in East Austin. The company had begun not with venture capital, but with pooled savings and donated equipment. Her mother had recruited local teens, trained them, and paid them with whatever the company could afford. Naomi, then in her late teens, had been among the first to build and code the prototypes. "She taught me that sustainability doesn't start in boardrooms," Naomi said. "It starts where people can't afford to wait for change." After the session ended, Michael stepped out of the room and found a quiet corner in the hallway. He pulled out his phone and began searching, something he admitted himself he should have done long ago. Articles, interviews, archives. A 2018 feature in a national engineering magazine. A TED-style talk from 3 years earlier. A long-form essay Naomi had written about energy justice and access in low-income communities. It was all there. The pedigree, the impact, the undeniable genius of someone who had never needed anyone's permission to lead, yet had been denied acknowledgement in a dozen subtle ways, one of which had come from him just hours ago. He kept reading until he stumbled across a documentary clip in which Naomi spoke of her grandfather's funeral. He had passed before she finished her doctorate, and in her eulogy, she had said something that now gnawed at Michael with particular force. "He told me once that people might not always shake your hand, but if they ever learn your name, make sure they remember it for what you did." The screen blurred for a second. Michael blinked, unsure if it was the light or something else. He knew what was happening. This wasn't just guilt. It was the unraveling of an illusion. That he had always been fair, always professional, always principled. But fairness, he now saw, was too often measured by the comfort of the person claiming it. By early evening, the conference neared its close. Michael noticed Naomi standing near the registration table, speaking with 2 college students and handing them her business card. She laughed at something one of them said. Her expression relaxed. It was a different side of her, less formal, more personal. It struck Michael how easily she moved between those modes, as if she had long since learned how to adapt to whatever space she entered, whether or not it had been designed for her. He didn't know if he had the right to interrupt, but something told him he couldn't leave without trying. As the students walked away, he approached slowly, keeping his voice low. "Dr. Ellis," he said. She turned toward him. No surprise crossed her face. She recognized him instantly. "Mr. Reed," she replied, with calm that neither welcomed nor rejected. He tried to start a sentence, but stumbled. About earlier. I didn't realize." Naomi waited, patient, measured. "I made an assumption," he finally said, "and I was wrong. Completely." For a brief moment, she studied him, not with disdain, but with the kind of clarity that comes from someone who had seen this pattern unfold too many times before. Then she offered a light nod. "I appreciate your honesty," she said. "Not everyone is willing to look at themselves that quickly." Michael looked down. It wasn't quick, he admitted. It was just late. She gave a half smile, not one of amusement, but of understanding. It's never too late, Mr. Reed. But the work doesn't stop at the apology. Before he could respond, someone called her name from across the room. She gave him a parting look and said, "Enjoy the rest of your evening." And just like that, she turned and walked away, not dismissively, but with a sense of purpose that told him she had already moved forward. Michael stood there for a moment longer, surrounded by the faint hum of departing voices and the last claps of conversation. He felt like a man who had finally started hearing a song that had always been playing in the background, but he had never paid attention to the lyrics. The handshake had never been the beginning. And this wasn't the end. The day after the conference, Michael Reed arrived at the Hale Energy office earlier than usual. The building still smelled faintly of the coffee and pastries that had been served at the reception tables the day before, remnants of a polished event that now lingered like shadows in his mind. He sat at his desk and turned on a computer, but the usual rhythm of his morning, email checks, meeting notes, calendar adjustments, felt pointless. Every time he blinked, he saw Naomi Ellis's eyes, not angry, not dismissive, just calm and certain. Eyes that had seen through him with the clarity of someone who had learned to navigate the world without expecting fairness, and yet still choosing grace. A knock at his door pulled him from his thoughts. It was Danielle, one of his junior managers, holding a notepad. "You've got to wrap up with comms at 10 and a ESG debrief at 11, she said. He nodded absently. "Thanks, Danielle." She lingered a moment longer. People are still talking about yesterday. Michael looked up. "The conference?" She gave a slow, knowing nod. Dr. Ellis, mostly. That moment in her talk, when she mentioned being refused a handshake, that landed hard. Michael leaned back in his chair. "Yeah, I noticed." Danielle hesitated, then added, "I think a few people knew it was you." He didn't respond immediately. Then, without looking at her, he said, "Let them. I deserve to be seen." Danielle gave a quiet nod, then stepped out, closing the door gently behind her. Later that afternoon, while reviewing internal reports in the conference room, Michael received an email with no subject line. The sender, Naomi Ellis. He stared at the screen for a long moment before opening it. The body of the message was brief. "Mr. Reed, I'm sending this not out of obligation, but because I believe we're all still learning. Some people choose to teach with confrontation, others with silence. But sometimes the most enduring lessons come from reflection." Naomi, attached to the email, was a short essay titled, "What We Learn from Closed Hands." Michael printed it without reading it on screen. He needed to hold the paper in his hands, to feel the weight of it as something more than digital. He read it slowly. It wasn't about him, not directly, but every line found its mark. Naomi wrote of boardrooms where greetings were filtered through hesitation, of conferences where introductions depended on assumptions of power, race, age. She described the subtle erosion of dignity when someone chooses not to engage, not to acknowledge. She detailed how those moments accumulate, like invisible bruises, and how resilience becomes a habit of survival. She didn't accuse. She revealed. One paragraph struck Michael with particular force. "Sometimes it's not the words people say, but the hesitation before they say them that tells you everything." You learn to read that pause, the flicker in their eyes, the split second where they decide if you belong. And in that moment, even silence is loud. Michael folded the paper, placed it in his drawer, and sat in stillness. No meeting could shake him out of that reflection. He thought of the interns who came through Hale every summer. How often he had remembered the names of the young men, commented on their universities, asked them what they wanted to do. How often he had simply nodded at the young women, especially the ones of color, without really seeing them, not out of malice, just a practiced indifference that now screamed in hindsight. The following week, Hale Energy hosted its internal sustainability roundtable. Michael, still carrying the weight of Naomi's email, stood to make the opening remarks. The room was filled with employees across departments, engineers, analysts, interns, executives. He began his speech not with data, but with a story. I want to talk to you about what it means to walk past a door that's already open and still fail to see the person holding it open for you. A few people looked up, unsure where he was going. At last week's conference, he continued, I made a mistake. I dismissed someone who should have commanded my full attention, and not because she was important to our industry, not because of her company's influence, but because she was a human being who deserved basic respect. I missed that. I missed her. He didn't name Naomi, but the weight of her presence was felt in every word. The room remained silent, not in discomfort, but in recognition. Michael let that silence breathe. I share this, he said finally, because I want this to be a place where we don't have to learn our lessons the hard way. We're seeing people fully as part of how we lead. The room burst into applause, not the forced, obligatory kind, but the kind that comes from people who are grateful to see something shift. That evening, Michael returned to his office. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the floor. He opened the email again and reread the final line Naomi had written. Sometimes, the most enduring lessons come from reflection. He clicked reply and typed slowly. Dr. Ellis, thank you for your generosity in sending the essay. I have read it more than once. You were under no obligation to extend grace, yet you did. That alone taught me more than I expected to learn this year. If ever there is a space where I can support your work or amplify your voice, I will, not to make amends, but to make progress. Michael Reed. He hit send. He didn't expect a reply. Some lessons weren't meant to be reciprocated. They were meant to be carried forward. 3 days had passed since Michael had replied to Naomi's email, and though he hadn't received a response, he hadn't expected one. The silence felt intentional and strangely appropriate. It wasn't a cold absence of engagement, but the space left by someone who believed the real work had to happen privately, in the silence between interactions. Michael respected that. The point had never been to extract forgiveness. It was to sit with the discomfort and do something better with it. That morning, as he sipped his coffee in the quiet of his office, his phone buzzed softly. A new email. The subject line read, about what we learn when we're willing to be wrong. The sender, Naomi Ellis. He stared at it for a few seconds before opening it. Mr. Reed, I don't always reply to every message. Some deserve to be absorbed more than answered, but your note didn't feel like an attempt at closure. It felt like the beginning of a shift. That matters. So I'm sharing something with you, not for public relations, not for reputation management. Just a reminder that we are all capable of rewriting the narratives we inherit. Attached is a letter I once wrote to myself the day I founded Ellis Tech. I kept it private for years. But maybe now it belongs to a conversation between two people who both decided to start listening. Naomi. Michael opened the attached document. It was titled simply, Day 1. He began to read. The letter was raw and unpolished. It wasn't the voice of the poised executive he had seen at the conference. It was the voice of a young woman sitting in a rented office with secondhand furniture and a borrowed laptop, trying to build something that didn't yet exist. She wrote about fear, not just of failure, but of invisibility. The fear that her company would be overlooked because its founder didn't look like the image most investors expected. She wrote about the exhaustion of having to prove her worth twice before being trusted once. But she also wrote about faith, in people, in ideas, in the small daily acts that slowly construct a future. Near the end, Naomi had written, if they don't shake your hand, let them. You're not building this, so they'll see you. You're building this so no one else has to go unseen again. Michael read the line again, then a third time. It hit him with more force than he was ready for. He printed the letter and pinned it to the inside of his office cabinet. It felt almost sacred, too personal to display publicly, but too important to forget. He didn't reply immediately. He wanted to let her message live with him for a while, undisturbed. Later that week, he joined a meeting with the company's outreach and recruitment division. A new initiative was being launched to identify talent from underrepresented communities. And while Michael had always signed off on these programs before, this time he asked to be involved directly. He didn't make a speech or ask for recognition. Instead, he listened to the young staffers proposing community tech workshops. to the interns suggesting more inclusive interview processes. He asked questions, not to challenge, but to understand. His tone had changed. It wasn't just more measured. It was quieter, more deliberate. He no longer spoke with the weight of authority, but with the curiosity of someone who had finally realized how much he had missed. In a meeting the following day, he pulled aside the company's HR director, a woman named Renee, who had worked with him for over a decade. "I've been thinking," Michael began, "about how we onboard new hires, especially young engineers. I want to make sure we're not just assessing resumes, but actually seeing people. What kind of changes would that take?" Renee looked at him for a moment, surprised. "That's not something I expected you to ask," she said. "Maybe it should have been," he replied. She smiled faintly. "It'll take time, but it's possible." "I'm okay with time," he said. "What I'm not okay with anymore is pretending we're already there." Later that evening, long after most of the office had cleared out, Michael sat alone and reopened Naomi's email. He read her words again, thinking of how rarely people are given the chance to reframe who they are, not because someone demands it, but because someone invites it. He began to write, not as a formal reply, but as a kind of journal entry, a personal reckoning. "I used to think leadership was about decisiveness, clarity, control, but now I see that real leadership might be about humility, about the courage to be quiet, to listen, and to let others lead where your understanding ends." He saved the file, unsure if he'd ever share it. Some lessons he was learning didn't need to be turned into presentations. They just needed to be lived. The next day, as Michael entered the building's main lobby, a new hire was being greeted by the front desk. She looked young, maybe fresh out of college, holding a tablet and wearing an oversized coat. As he walked by, she turned and smiled politely. "Good morning," she said, offering her hand. Michael stopped, turned fully to face her, and shook her hand with a firmness that was grounded, respectful, and without hesitation. "Good morning," he said. "Welcome to Hale. I'm Michael Reed." Her smile widened. "Nice to meet you, Mr. Reed. I'm Dana, just started in data systems." "Glad to have you here, Dana. If you ever need anything, don't hesitate to reach out." As he walked away, he realized something quietly powerful. That moment, that gesture, so simple, so often overlooked, had become, to him, a ritual of intention, a signal that he had changed, that he was still changing. It wasn't about making up for the past. It was about never repeating it again. And from that point forward, every hand he shook carried a memory of the one he didn't.